Hello there, and welcome back to the Codex. So this is going to be a follow-up to what is currently the most popular video on my channel. You're doing too much damage. In the comments of that video, some of you asked the opposing question, how do I actually do enough damage? So in today's video, we're going to be going over that with some basic modding principles. There's a few core subjects that we're going to be covering, including additive versus multiplicative scaling, diminishing returns, faction modifiers, and exceptions to the rule. So let's go ahead and hop over to the arsenal and get into that. So here we're using the Dread Bow as an example of the weapon that we're going to be modding to go over some of these principles. Let's go ahead and take a few shots of these corrupted heavy gunners and see how much damage that we do. As you'll be able to see here, most of the numbers that we see are either 90 or 181. You can see the 181 are yellow hits, and the 90 is white hits. Let's go ahead and go over to the arsenal and talk about why that is. So if we open this up, we can see that currently there's no mods on this Dread. We have 168 base damage spread across puncture, impact, and slash, 50% crit chance, a 2x crit multiplier, and those are some of the main stats that we'll focus on right now. So the reason why you saw both white and yellow colored hits is because white hits are base non-critical damage. So on a standard hit that isn't being multiplied by a crit, we were doing 90 damage. But since we have a critical chance of 50%, that means that half of the time we do damage that is multiplied by our critical multiplier, which in this case is 2x. That's why that 90 got doubled up to about 180 damage, roughly half the time, thanks to that 50% crit chance. So there's a few different ways that I can up my damage here. The first of which, being generally the most obvious, is just adding more direct actual base damage. So let's look at the Serration mod, for example. This adds 165% just flat out base damage. Let's go ahead and throw that on. And you can see that our total damage goes from 168 to 445, which is a 165% increase. So now if I go over and I start shooting at some of these corrupted heavy gunners, we should see that we do roughly 165% more damage on both regular hits, like the 239 you can see here, and additionally the 479, as you can see there, on critical hits, which again is roughly double the white hit damage. So let's go back and say, so that worked really well for us, adding 165% base damage. Why don't I go ahead and do that again with heavy caliber, and that should be great. So the problem with this is one of the concepts mentioned at the beginning of the video, which is diminishing returns. You can see that when we added the first 165% base damage mod, we actually gained a real 165% damage, except this time, again, we're adding 165% damage, so this mod does the same thing, but we only went from 445 to 722, and that's only about a 62% damage increase, and that will be reflected in the damage that we see here. If we start shooting these heavy gunners, you'll see that we are definitely not doing more than double the damage again, like how the first mod did. The reason for that is because both of these mods do the same thing. These are both base damage. So when you add the first mod on, it actually adds 165% total damage because it's the only base damage that you currently had on the weapon. But when you go and add another 165%, you have to keep in mind that you already had some base damage. So now instead of adding 165 to the weapon's original 100% damage, taking you from 100% to 265% of your total damage, you're now adding this to an already existing 265%, which means that this is really only about a 62% damage increase now, less than half of what the first mod did. This is an example of diminishing returns and why you don't want to stack too much of the same stat on. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. What else could I potentially add to increase my damage? Well, this weapon does have a really nice base 50% critical chance. So what if I go ahead and put on Point Strike to increase my critical chance? Just to make the math easy, we're going to use a rank 3 Point Strike, which has a 100% crit chance, bringing us up to exactly 100% on the weapon, which means that we have a guaranteed chance to activate that critical multiplier. So now, instead of only doing double damage half the time, which averages out to doing about 1.5x as much damage on average, we now do double damage 100% of the time, which means that we do double damage on average because it's constant. So this effectively doubles your average DPS. Now if we go and shoot these guys with the Dread, you're going to see that we only deal yellow hits because you're always now benefiting from that critical multiplier. So how else can we benefit from the fact that we've now done that? Well, if we're critting all of the time, it would also make sense to try and make those critical hits more powerful. So what if we throw on Vital Sense, which gives you 120% more crit damage? This now takes our critical multiplier from 2x up to 4.4x. This, again, more than doubles our damage. Since we're always critting, and we more than doubled our critical multiplier, we've more than doubled our average damage from 2x to 4.4x multiplication. So yet again, we go and take a few shots of these guys, and we keep seeing our average numbers going up and up and up. We're now up to 1.1k damage, and that's every single hit is a critical hit. So what else can we do? Well, you can see there's a trend here. We're trying to keep adding new things that multiply off of each other as opposed to constantly adding more of the same stats. So what do we not have so far? Well, our shots do fairly decent damage, but what if I want to get those shots out faster? We can throw on Fire Rate, for example, with the mod Speed Trigger. Now, this technically won't make you do any more damage, but it will make you do more damage per second because we're now firing out more of those arrows more quickly. So we're getting more shots out per second. So you might be doing the same damage, but you're doing that damage more rapidly. Now, speaking of damage, so far we haven't added on any kinds of different damage to the weapon. So let's look at this. We can see we have Puncture, Impact, and Slash. Now, a lot of new players would make the mistake of looking at this and go like, wow, this has very little Puncture and Impact damage, but it has a whole lot of Slash damage. So why don't I type in Slash here and throw on, for example, Sawtooth Clip to increase this very large amount of Slash damage by 90%. And now we just took it from 356 to 676. That's a nice, huge increase. And that makes our total damage go to 765. Here is the problem with that. When you increase physical damage types, and when someone says physical, that means Puncture, Impact, and Slash, often referred to as IPS, short for Impact, Puncture, Slash. The problem with that is that a physical damage mod only increases its physical damage type by the percent stated. So when you put on this 90% Slash mod, you're only increasing the Slash damage by 90%, which makes sense. There's something better we can do. We can throw on an elemental damage mod, for example, Infected Clip. Even though both of these mods are 90%, this is 90% Slash, and this is 90% Toxin, this is actually going to be stronger. You can see it's now an 845 total damage. The reason for that is that elemental mods scale off of the weapon's total base damage for the percent that they increase. So when this says plus 90% Toxin, it takes 90% of the weapon's total Puncture, Impact, and Slash damage, takes 90% of that, and then adds it on as Toxin damage, as opposed to the Slash mod was only taking 90% of the Slash. So we now have basically a 1.9x damage multiplier because this is the first elemental damage mod that we've put on the weapon. Now, typically, you don't want to use just one elemental mod. You want to use what's called hybrid elements. So since we already have Toxin on, let's go ahead and throw on one of the other popular kinds of elements in the game, which is Cold. So let's go ahead and throw on, for example, Rime Rounds. Now that we have both Toxin and Cold, they combined together to make viral damage. And now our total damage is all the way up to 1,113. Now there's a few good things about putting elements on a weapon besides just, of course, adding more roll damage. And that's both the faction modifiers and the status effects that they have. Viral damage, for example, is one of the most popular damage types in the game for its status effect. The status effect is viral increases damage to health up to 325% with multiple stacks for a short duration. A 325% damage increase means that you are multiplying your damage by over 4 times if you have a full stack of 10 procs to the enemy. And then at the top here, if you look at damage efficacy, like I mentioned earlier in the video, we have something called faction modifiers. Every damage type in the game does either more, less, or neutral damage to all the different factions. The enemy that we've been testing against counts as an Orokin enemy. So the fact that I just put on viral damage, which does 1.5 times, as in 50% more damage to Oroku, means that this weapon is now going to be much better at dealing damage against the enemies that we're testing against. So let's go ahead and go over here and shoot these guys again. And you can see we've now gotten our damage up to 2.8k. This is more than double what we previously saw at the 1.1k. So let's go back to the arsenal here yet again. What's another stat that we can add on that we haven't yet added? We have base damage, we have critical chance, critical damage, we shoot faster with fire rate, we have some elemental damage on here. What about Multishot with split chamber? This mod is exceptionally powerful because this says it gives us plus 90% Multishot. What Multishot does is that it gives you a chance to shoot more shots for free. So 90% Multishot means that we have a 90% chance that we'll shoot 2 arrows instead of 1, but it still only consumes 1 arrow. So this nearly doubles your average DPS. We can prove that by going over here. Now again, since we're shooting more rounds and not increasing the damage of it, we're not actually going to do more than that 2.8k damage, but we'll now see that we're hitting 2.8k twice because we're most of the time firing 2 of those arrows as opposed to 1. You can also see now we're all the way up to 7k damage because we've applied some of those viral procs. So again, that viral status effect is multiplying our damage. You can see we're really ramping up the damage factor now. So let's go ahead and go back here. What other factors have we not yet added? Well, let's look at this more complete build here. Now we've switched over to a corrosive cold build using a prime mod for cold damage. You can see that this has most of the same mods on. We've went ahead and maxed out that point strike as well. So now we have 125% crit chance instead of 100, along with all of this large amount of corrosive and cold damage. Now, what does going past 100% crit chance do? Well, it gives you a chance to hit larger critical tiers. So far, you've only seen white hits, which is non-critical hits, and yellow hits, which is normal critical hits. If you go above 100%, you can hit what's called big critical hits, and if you go above 200%, you can hit what's called super critical hits. Every time that you go into one of those next critical tiers, it actually increases your effective critical multiplier. It won't show you that in the arsenal, but it will do that in the background. Now, what it does when you hit those new critical tiers is that you do an extra critical multiplier equivalent to your modded critical multiplier -1. So for example, since we have a 4.4x critical multiplier, if we hit that 25% chance for an orange crit, that orange crit does this 4.4 plus an additional 3.4, because again, it would be 4.4 -1. So instead of 4.4 damage, we would now do 7.8x damage, which is a huge damage increase. Let's go ahead and show that in action and shoot this a few times until we hit that orange crit. You can see there's one right there. We hit a 2.9k as one of the 2 hits. Again, we still have that multi-shot, and since we're firing 2 arrows at once, each individual arrow has its own chance of whether or not it's going to be an orange crit. So it is possible to get both a yellow and an orange, or 2 yellows, or 2 oranges, because every hit is calculated independently. As you can see, we just did that again right there, where we got an orange and a yellow hit. Now, of course, later in the game, you're going to have more advanced setups, where maybe you unlock this arcane slot here. So let's go ahead and go to this 3rd slot here and say, so what if I unlock my arcane slot for I unlock Steel Path, for example, and I start using something like, I don't know, Primary Merciless. This gives you 360% base damage when it's fully stacked up. So again, going back to the concept of diminishing returns, you might think, well, maybe I don't want to use Serration anymore because I already have so much base damage from Merciless. So I swapped out Serration for Hammer Shot, which gives us another 60% crit damage and 80% status chance. So it's doubling up on the utility for the weapon here. As you can see, we also swapped out Point Strike for critical delay, which gives you even more crit chance, and we swapped out Speed Trigger for Vile Acceleration, which gives you even more fire rate. So, and we, of course, also swapped out Split Chamber for Galvanized Chamber. This now gives you, when it's fully stacked up, 230% multi-shot instead of 90%. So you now always shoot at least 3 shots with a 30% chance at a 4th, as opposed to regular split chamber, is only a 90% chance at hitting that second shot. So big damage increase going from a normal build to a build like this. So let's go ahead and show this build in action. Now, keeping in mind that now that we're using two different conditional effects, one of which is Galvanized Chamber, which requires kills to stack up, and also an Arcane, which requires kills to stack up, the first few kills will be slower, but then once you get those damage bonuses going, it'll be a lot higher. Now, to keep in theme with the idea of keeping lots of different multipliers all stacked together in a weapon, let's actually switch this Arcane to Deadhead. Now, this gives you the same 360% damage that Merciless has, but it also has a 30% increase to the headshot multiplier. So that's, again, one more multiplier that we're combining together to make this weapon do much, much more damage. Let's go ahead and showcase this in action here. So I'm going to go for headshots, because for one, we're using Deadhead, which requires headshots to activate, and also critical headshots in Warframe do 6 times as much damage as a body shot. So if you do keep going for headshots, even if you're not using the Deadhead Arcane, you're going to do loads more damage. As you can see, we're now doing over 100,000 damage a shot here on those headshots. Even on these body shots, we're still doing way, way more damage than we were doing. This is a great example of how you want to stack all of these different multipliers together to do as much damage as you possibly can. If we had instead just stacked a ton of base damage and like 4 different crit mods, it might look like pretty numbers in the arsenal, but we would actually end up doing much, much less real damage because we're not stacking things that multiply off of each other. That is how you do the real damage. Now, there's one more factor that I mentioned at the start of this video that we still need to go over, and that is exceptions to the rule of not using too many of the same type of mod to avoid the issue of diminishing returns. So let's use one of my favorite weapons as an example of this, and that is the Basmu. If we go into this Basmu build here, you'll see that between Galvanized Aptitude, which adds base damage, Primary Acuity, which is base damage and crit chance, and then Critical Delay, crit chance, Galvanized Scope, crit chance, and my Ribbon, which is crit chance and base damage, I have 5 mods on this build out of 8 that are dedicated to just crit chance and base damage, at least from the looks of it, and then also base damage from Deadhead. So I just talked about not using too much of the same stat on a weapon, so why am I doing this? Well, this weapon is an example of what we call a weapon that has multiplicative scaling. So Galvanized Aptitude is supposed to be 80% additional base damage added to the weapon for each additional status type on the target, and Primary Acuity is supposed to be 350% of your weapon's base critical chance added on, and 350% of a weapon's base damage added on when you shoot a weak point. But what these two mods actually do is that Galvanized Aptitude scales off of your modded base damage and adds 80% multiplicative damage onto the weapon, and Primary Acuity does the same thing. Instead of adding 350% weak point damage, it actually takes your fully modded base damage after Deadhead and after the base damage from my Ribbon, and then multiplies that by 4.5, and it does the same thing for crit chance. So all of the crit chance from Critical Delay, Galvanized Scope, and my Ribbon are then multiplied by 4.5 on weak point hits. So even though it says 75% crit chance in the arsenal, my Basma build actually has over 400 or 500% critical chance because of how this mod works, and way more base damage than you might think, because again, the base damage from both this mod and this mod are actually multiplicative with normal base damage. So these actually are separate multipliers, they just don't look like it based off of what we just discussed. And I can prove that by going and absolutely obliterating these enemies here. Again, the first few kills are going to be a little slower because we need to stack up the mods, but then once that's going, you see we do an absolutely absurd amount of damage. You instantaneously kill these enemies. This is so strong, in fact, that I take this weapon to literal level cap, as in level 10,000 enemies, because it does such an insane amount of damage. So of course, as you get later in the game, you'll discover there's some nuance to some of the weapons and some of the mechanics in the game that you'll have to learn about. But this video, I wanted to primarily go over, especially for new players, the basics of modding and make sure that you avoid those simple starting mistakes. For example, not using too much of the same stat on normal weapons. Hopefully this video helped you out, guys. If it did, let me know down below. As a new player, is this kind of information valuable to you? Was it in an understandable format? I, of course, want to hear your feedback. And if you felt like I left anything out, rather, that should be included in a video like this, you can, of course, let me know that down below as well, and I'll make sure to include that in the future. Anyways, hopefully it was helpful, and I'll see you guys in the next one.